What's up, guys? Welcome to your lesson for the day. Last time we met, we talked about anarchy and socialism and these kind of movements going on in the United States in the early 1900s. So, this all was happening really during McKinley's presidency. Now, we ran into some issues as far as what the news was reporting that kind of shifted people's mindsets a certain way. But there would be a gentleman that came out of this to really kind of curb what was going on as far as this um, violent progressive movement, and that would be Teddy Roosevelt. So we're going to start off today. We're going to look at Teddy Roosevelt and just kind of who he was and what he did. So if you are following along with me, we're going to go ahead and start on slide number 56 in our presentation, and we will go from there. So, who was Teddy Roosevelt? Well, Teddy Roosevelt was born in Manhattan, and his family was pretty well off, but he himself was born sickly. He was scrawny. He was not a very healthy young kid, um, and that was part of why he would end up being homeschooled. Now, he was a decent student, and he had one attribute that most people don't. He has a photographic memory. So this allows him to see a lot of success throughout his lifetime. Just the fact that he could remember things just by looking at them, he recalls them almost perfectly. And this allows him to, uh, finish his homeschooling. Then he would go on to college at Harvard, where he's going to be a pretty good student, and he's also going to participate in rowing and boxing. So he's not your typical future politician, right? He's working as a boxer and as someone who's on the road team, and he has a photographic memory. He's just interesting all around, right? So he excelled in naval strategy, which is kind of weird, right? Like why would he think this? Why would they care? Well, his photographic memory helps him understand how to kind of manipulate things and how to make things successful. So while he's at college, he scrutinizes various like US naval practices of war, specifically in the War of 1812, or also known as the Second American Revolution. He criticizes it and really just kind of points out the flaws in the naval structure of that. And so he he writes a kind of dissertation about how this is a failure, and it's published and it's still used as a naval strategy kind of critique even to today. So this happened in early 1900s, and people still look at this and go, "Wow, this guy knew what he was talking about." So far you have this kind of super genius guy who grew up well off but sickly, turns into a boxer, a college boxer, and pretty much rips apart the U.S. naval strategy for the War of 1812. So it's kind of cool. Anyway, he graduates from Harvard, and he enters into the New York State Assembly. So he's going to be a not he's kind of a entry level politician, but he's going to become a very trusted voice in the Republican Party. He speaks at the national convention. He convinces people in their party to nominate African Americans into higher roles into the GOP party. In fact, the GOP chairman, which is kind of leader of the Republican Party, was John R. Lynch, who was African American, and he really advocated for this. So you can see Teddy Roosevelt was very um, kind of just accepting of everybody, and just really an all around kind of bright guy. So kind of cool. Anyway, so after he helps this guy get elected to the GOP chair, he moves back to North here. He moves to North Dakota, where he's really interested in roping and riding and kind of doing all the cowboy stuff, and he does, and he earns a lot of respect of the cowboys in that area. A couple years later, he's approached by some guys from New York and say, "Hey, we know how good you are at politics. We want you to run for mayor of New York." And he said, "Well, who am I going to be running against?" He said, "You're going to be running against the United Labor Party, Henry George. Um, he's a Democrat, blah, blah, blah. So this doesn't really work out too well. Um, yes, Teddy Roosevelt tries to run for mayor, but he loses. And so he ends up going into the volunteer cavalry. So he's not the mayor. It's not the first time he's seen failure in his life, but it's definitely one of these times where he kind of wants to reassess. So he steps away from politics again. Uh, he forms a U.S. cavalry, like I said, and they're going to be known as the Rough Riders, and they become kind of legends, especially in the Spanish American War. Um, really, just here's these guys. They're not your typical military guys. They're just kind of awesome, right? So after the Spanish American War and after Roosevelt did all this kind of crazy stuff, his name recognition alone, because he was part of the Rough Riders, would allow him to re-enter politics with more backing, mind you. So he runs for New York governor in 1898 and wins, and then he becomes vice president in 1900. Now, this is when you're seeing McKinley get shot in 1901. So we have, after McKinley dies, Roosevelt steps in, and that's where he's going to start kind of messing with the natural, not the natural order, but the general order of things at this time. So Roosevelt's in office. He's doing his thing. He kind of settles down this anarchy movement, but he realizes that workers do need a little bit of a hand. So Roosevelt believes that big business is an essential part of the American economy. After all, we are a capitalist society, so we need to have that. But he thinks that monopolies are just aren't good for the country. It 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 restricts trade. It allows companies to kind of set unfair prices, and it's just not good. So, what we would call a monopoly, another term for that is a trust. So, when you're talking about trust busting, they're breaking up monopolies. So, he uses this thing called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was written in 1890, but nobody really followed it, to regulate monopolies and break them up into different pieces. So, companies like Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel, which we've talked about in the past, they forced them to break up, and it essentially ended monopolies in the United States as a whole. Ironically, Rockefeller and Carnegie, once they had to break up their companies, they had to sell off parts of them, and they ended up making more money with the sell off. But at least they didn't have the monopolies anymore. So, kind of cool. Now, like I said, we're going to talk about Roosevelt quite a bit, so bear with me. He has some domestic fixes, so things that are happening in America. Um, as far as railroads goes, merchants are going to start to be complaining about the higher rates. Um, uh, just remember, railroads are privately owned and operated, so they can charge whatever they want. Now, there's not just one person who runs the railroad, so there is competition. But when they all kind of get together and say, "Hey, we should all charge this," you see the price starting to grow. And he's going to end up creating a bill that lowers those rates and says, hey, we're going to make these rates just and reasonable. We understand that these businesses are there to make money. That's the point of owning a business, is to make money. But we can't expect the people to be paying this if they're going to be using it. So we have to fix that. Let's lower the rates. They can be reasonable. They don't have to be extreme, but here we go. So Roosevelt does this. Again, now you can argue this is unconstitutional, right? The government shouldn't be stepping in telling businesses how much to spend or how much to charge, but still, nonetheless, this is where we are. He looks at the food and drug services. He forces companies to improve and ban labels and pretty much anything that uses harmful chemicals or anything that could be considered harmful chemicals, you had to put on your label. You couldn't just be like, this is good for you and it has arsenic in it. That's not good. You can't do that. And he's going to establish 380 million acres of national forest. So he's doing things to help the American people as far as what could the workers handle? What do they need right now? And he kind of focuses on that, and Roosevelt does a pretty good job. Yeah. So that's Roosevelt. That's Roosevelt in a nutshell. He does some pretty interesting stuff. He kind of continues. on this path of we are going to look out for the American people. That's what we're going to do. Now let's step away from Roosevelt for a minute and let's look at the rest of the world in the 20th century. Again, if you're following with me on your presentation, we're on slide number 60. That's 60. So, powers around the world at this time are seeing a rise in four different things. And hopefully, you've learned this in your world history. We're getting into World War One, and we always talk about the main reasons for World War One. Well, each country is falling into these categories, right? So, you have Germany and England and Italy and Spain and France, whatever. They're falling into these four things. The first one is militarism, so they're building up a national military, preparing for war, just constantly preparing for war. Even though they're not like we're not going to go to war, but we want to be ready. Alliances, so they're creating ties with other countries for protection. Imperialism, which we've talked about, and that's extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. And finally, nationalism or extreme pride or devotion to one's country. You put those together, you have the four main points. And main points, MAIN, main, those are the reasons for um, kind of the world's going to end up in some turmoil. Now, obviously, if all these countries are looking at militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, rivalries are going to kind of pop up. So you're looking at Europe. You see a rivalry among European nations. Germany's going to be rivals with Great Britain. Austria-Hungary are going to be rivals with Russia, Italy, with France. And just territorial disputes are breaking out, right? Imperialism has kind of caused this, that's my land, I'm going to take it, get off my land kind of mentality. So they're just kind of racing to see who can get the most stuff. And while they're doing this, they're building up their military. And when they're building up their military and getting more land, they're feeling more pride in their country. It's just this kind of vicious cycle. So we have these rivalries just growing and growing and growing. And we're going to see what happens. So right around, I say 19, late 1800s, Germany. I know this is American history, but I gotta talk about the world stuff because it doesn't make sense unless you understand the world. So late 1800s, Germany was under the leadership of a guy named Otto von Bismarck. So he starts going around and forging alliances with surrounding countries, saying, "Hey, Italy, be on our side. Hey, Austria-Hungary, be on our side." They're a little afraid that France might start some type of conflict. So they're like, "Hey, let's get together, let's work it out, let's be homies." So they do, but in response, France is going to start forging alliances as well, specifically with Russia and Great Britain. All right, so the France, Russia, and Great Britain alliance is known as the Triple Entente, and the Italy, Austria-Hungary, and France alliance is going to be known as the Triple Alliance. So you have these three kind of these six countries, but two groups set up. Now there would be an expansion on the Triple Entente. They would add, you know, weird stuff, but we're not gonna talk about that. It ends up being called the Entente Cordiale. Anyway, these alliances are meant to be secret, but they don't stay secret very long. And rival countries start seeing more and more tension, right? Why are you getting these countries together militaristically? Like, are you trying to invade us? What's going on? So there's this kind of, you know, he said, she said, now I'm bringing my friends to a fight. It's just getting really, really crazy as far as where things are going on in Europe. Now, what happens? Well, these alliances are being forged and crazy things are happening, and there is an Austria-Hungary duke, archduke, sorry, and he and his wife Sophie are visiting Sarah, yeah, I can't talk right now. They're up in Bosnia, just kind of doing a, you know, diplomatic trip, And there's a gentleman by the name of Gavrilo Princip runs out and shoots Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. Now, Gavrilo Princip, he was one of 6 assassins um, put together by the secret Serbian group known as the Black Hand. There were several people that were supposed to be killing Franz Ferdinand, and just so happened that Gavrilo Princip was the one on the right route to kill him. So he kills Franz Ferdinand, kills his wife, and bad things are going to happen from that. So what happens? What's the outcome of all this? So there's this anti-Serb rioting breaks out, and Austria-Hungary is saying, "Hey, you need to fix this, Serbia. This is messed up. You need to pay us reparations for the assassination of our Archduke and his wife. You need to do this. It's not good, and you need to do an investigation into the assassination itself." There would be an investigation. They would look into it, but Germany convinces Austria-Hungary to write a letter to Serbia with a bunch of demands. Austria-Hungary would be happy with just taking Gavrilo Princip and saying, "Hey, we're gonna try him. We're gonna jail him. We might execute him." But Germany's like, "No, no, no, no. You should totally write them more demands. So like, you need to pay us a bunch of money and do all this stuff." So Serbia gets this letter and goes, "Yeah, we'll comply to some of these, but they didn't comply to all of them." And in return, Austria-Hungary says, "You know what? Fine, we're declaring war on Serbia." And really, this is where World War One starts. Now you're like, I didn't think Austria-Hungary and Serbia were the reasons that World War One started. Well, they were, but since Russia and Serbia kind of were buddies. Like they're not formally allies, but Russia did seek political and religious influence in Serbia. So they weren't on paper allies, but they were cultural allies, if that makes sense. And Russia says, hey, if Serbia is attacked, we're going to fight on the side of Serbia. And so once Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, Russia then gets involved. Once Russia gets involved, the Triple Entente, so you have, France and Great Britain, they become involved, and then Germany becomes involved. It's just this big, crazy fight. All right, cool. So I'm going to leave off on notes there. We covered, a little bit, probably a little less than I want to, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. And typically we would have taken a break by this point, but that's going to be it for now. Please, please, please make sure you guys are doing your check-ins so I can mark you here. Other than that, have a great rest of your day, and we will see you later.